First of all, thank you, everyone, for attending this talk virtually under these stressing circumstances. But in a greater sense, too, thank you not just for watching this video, but for taking an interest in rising to the challenge of what is really a very difficult book. You love to see it, people who aren't being made by an academic who teaches them in a college setting, to try and tackle these difficult texts. So I really appreciate that. And thank you to Kathleen and to the U City Library for giving the community the opportunity to engage this text and to talk with each other about it. One thing that's really going to help is that community aspect. It's really even more difficult to get through a book like this by yourself, but if you have people to help you through it, to give it a sort of social aspect, you can tackle it. That's a part of the reason that it works so well in classrooms, but certainly a social aspect is very helpful. I have to apologize for my appearance. I promise that ordinarily I look a little bit more like a university professor who's supposed to have a certain sort of chic level of disheveledness, but I still don't feel comfortable going to the hairdressers yet, so it's been, I don't know, 3.5 months since my haircut and trim, so I tried to gussy myself up as much as I could, but I suppose that most of us are probably used to not looking our best during the time of COVID, and at least I'm not wearing sweatpants because I had to leave the house and actually dress up. So I'm Michael O'Brien. I'm a lecturer at Washington University in St. Louis, WashU, and I teach rhetoric, writing, and introductory literature courses there. I got my PhD also at WashU in 2014, I think is when I finished writing a dissertation about the influence of anarchist philosophy and protest movements on 20th century experimental literature. My dissertation stopped at the 70s, so I did not actually write about Infinite Jest, but I wrote about a lot of the books that are in the literary tradition that Infinite Jest is very consciously responding to. We can go ahead and get started, I suppose. I have to say, I'm a little bit nervous about what I'm trying to do here, in the sense that having one 40-minute to hour-long talk to try and cover everything that needs to be covered to try and get somebody through a text like this is a fairly difficult thing to do, especially since I have to walk a sort of knife edge between wanting to make this seem as accessible and simple as possible while also trying to explain what oftentimes is a lot of very difficult intellectual depth. When you're teaching a book, you can always sort of give everybody an introductory pep talk and then check in every 3 days. But now I have to try and cover everything, so I'm going to do my best with that. And the way I decided to do that was to break the talk up to 4 parts. So I am going to start with some biographical information about David Foster Wallace, and then the most English professory and jargon-heavy moment is going to be part 2, where I talk about the literary context, which is where I fall into the knife-edge side of having to be abstract and somewhat difficult, although I do try to keep it as jargon-free as possible. It's hard not to do this. This is a book that is very referential, refers out to many other things, and it's also very self-conscious about what books are and where it sits in literary history. So it's hard to explain what it's doing without talking about other literary ideas and books, because it's oftentimes referring explicitly to those books as it thinks through what it wants to do. So those 2 things together are the ways that I would encourage everybody to critically approach the book. And then in my second 2 parts, I try and give you as many tools as I can to get through the process of just making it through the pages of the book. So in plot and structure, I explain the sort of speculative fiction world of the novel and the overall structure of the book in a very basic sense. And then in challenges and themes, I try and go over some of the things that people oftentimes find difficult about the book, as well as what I think are the major themes that someone might be able to take away. And then the last part there is just that I'll have a list of a couple of helping resources that you can use to get through it. So, biography. This is David Foster Wallace. I found a photo of him where he's got this iconic bandana that he used to wear around his head. He does that because, and I can sympathize with him in this respect, he was an intensely sweaty man. And as you've all probably noticed if you've begun this book, he's also an incredibly introspective and self-conscious person, and this caused him great angst. One of the characters in the book from the Tennis Academy actually has this same problem, and that's definitely a moment of sort of biography. So he wore this bandana to try and mop up the sweat, and then it kind of became a fashion statement, and it was iconic. He was born in 1962, so technically a boomer, I think, according to demographers, which is a bit odd because he would be considered just sort of the archetypal Generation X writer, but he's actually technically a few years early for that. And he died early in 2008, which I'm guessing many people know about, but we'll get to as I do the biography. Okay. So Wallace was born in Ithaca, New York, but really was raised in Urbana, Illinois. He moved there early. Did that because his parents were both academics. His father was a professor at the University of Illinois, Urbana, in in philosophy. His mother was an English professor at a community college in the area. You can already see there, hopefully, some ways in which his biography comes to bear on Infinite Jest, where the Incandenza family, which is one of the central groups of characters in the book, in many ways resembles his own background, with his brilliant but aloof parents, and his mother, an English professor who was an aggressive grammarian, as Avril Incandenza is in the novel. He was also, like many of the young characters in the book, a regionally ranked tennis player. He made it up to 11 in juniors tennis for Illinois. So it's funny, if you listen to him talk in interviews, people always want to try and say, oh, well, you were this almost near-great tennis player, and he corrects them. He's a very self-conscious person. And he says, no, I was like the 11th best in Illinois, which isn't a tennis hotbed. So as far as competitive tennis is concerned, I was only okay. But then, of course, at the same time, he has to let you know that being okay as far as competitive junior tennis goes is actually better than almost anybody at tennis. So he's good, but he's not good, and he goes into this whole shtick, which again is actually a large digression that you will find at one point in the novel, when they talk about the difference between greatness, near greatness, and being just okay in a competitive circuit. So he was one of these okay people. He wound up giving it up when he was a teenager because he found himself too self-conscious to be able to achieve the next plateau of his play. He was a bright student, that probably goes without saying, but he was, from his mid-teens forward, also deeply emotionally and psychologically troubled. His family and friends had all noticed this. What they didn't know was that from the time that he was 15 or 16 years old, he'd begun to abuse alcohol, marijuana, and then he was always circumspect about the extent of his drug use. Well, he was clear that he did a lot, but exactly what he did and when was a little bit more circumspect. But one imagines from the depth of knowledge about various types of pharmaceuticals in the book, it wasn't just alcohol and pot, he attributed a lot of his mental health problems to the addiction, but like Hal Incandenza in the book, he actually kept this hidden from everybody that he knew for the first several years of his life. So he was struggling with addiction sort of by himself, as everyone else just saw that he was having emotional and psychological problems. He went to Amherst College, which is his father's alma mater. He graduated summa cum laude in, did I say that right? Summa cum laude, is that right?
So.
I'm a professor, I should know that.
Yeah.
In 1985, with a dual major in English and philosophy, which is a cocktail that I also consumed, although on the opposite coast. He wrote an honors thesis in both subjects. His philosophy thesis was at this intersection of formal logic, philosophy of language, and the study of time, which is something that is also referenced constantly throughout the book, but I won't say too much more about that because honestly you can manage to read the book without understanding the relationship of the philosophy of language to logic and the philosophy of time. But he wrote an undergraduate thesis, and I mention this because posthumously this gets published and some people read it and they try and use it as a key to what's going on in his fiction. His English thesis was the first draft of his first novel, The Broom of the System, which came out in 1987. So you can already see here too, this is not to say anything disparaging about undergraduate theses, but to have a person who writes two of them in the same year, and one of them becomes a publishable book of philosophy, and one of them becomes the first draft of a canonical novel in post-45 American literature, is to say that he was a precocious and gifted student in any other ways that he may have been troubled. After he finished in 1985, it took a couple years for the book to come out because he went to an MFA program at the University of Arizona, which you'll also have noticed is a setting in parts of the book where he's describing the campus where Hal is trying to go and has this disastrous interview at the beginning of the book. He knows it because he was there. He had a bit of an ambivalent relationship, but MFA programs generally tend to encourage a very specific type of late century American realism. You can think Flannery O'Connor or Raymond Carver, and they tend to eschew the abstract, the experimental, the difficult, and formally difficult. I don't want to say that realism can't be difficult in other ways, it can be. And so it was really kind of odd for David Foster Wallace to be writing novels like this, very self-conscious and experimental novels in an MFA program. But he often spoke about how he appreciated that at this particular program they will let you do that, and they encouraged him to do it. And And while he obviously is a person who has some problems with institutional structures, he was grateful for the time that he had there. So yeah, he finished it, and at the same time, he sold his short story collection, A Girl with Curious Hair. So now he's an MFA graduate who has a short story collection contracted and in proofs and a novel out, which is perhaps even more of an accomplishment for an MFA student than the theses are for an undergraduate student. So he's ascending in his career. But from there, he begins to have problems. So that moment marks the end of what the critic Stephen J. Byrne, I've got one of his books here. Byrne divides Wallace's career into 3 stages, and he says that each one of them is a novel and a short story collection, and that they coincide with different phases of his life. So phase 1 ends with that sort of quickly ascendant early promise, and everyone wants to see where he's going to go next, but his substance abuse issues continue to embroil him and drag him down. His mental health problems become more severe. He survives at least one suicide attempt. He winds up institutionalized a few times, and he's finding it very difficult to psychologically pull himself together enough to write. So between 1986 and 1990, he tries several times to start the project that's going to become Infinite Jest, and he actually writes many of the little sketches that appear in the book through that period, but none of it's kind of coming together. So early in the book, there's this section that's written in what to his ear is Boston's African-American vernacular. If anybody's got to page 30 or so, they will caught this. It says, Wardine think her mama gonna kill her, I think is how it starts. He wrote that in 1986 as like a character sketch of a person in Boston. There's a number of these other things from that time that find their way into the book, but he couldn't pull it together. He was too distracted. So in 1989, he decides that having his MFA and his books published isn't enough, and he's going to start a PhD in philosophy at Harvard, where he goes and manages to make it there about 6 weeks before he collapses in a total nervous breakdown from his substance abuse issues and has to go on hold. He checks into a rehab facility connected to Harvard Medical School, and then from there, he winds up at a halfway house called Granada House that I've got a picture of right here, which is generally understood at this point to be like the Enid house in the novel, the major setting of the book other than the tennis academy, is basically a lightly fictionalized representation of this place that he stayed for 6 months. And so all of the stuff that you'll see in the book is the kind of thing that he went through, the AA and NA programs, the checkered cast of characters that he met, having to work, the class conflicts between, it shows how addiction can cut across both lower income and higher income people. This was, by all accounts, a struggle that he had all the time when he was there. Many of the people who were used to a more on-the-streets sort of lifestyle didn't quite understand why this upper-middle-class child of professors with books who was in a PhD program was there talking his intellectual talk. He did become involved in AA and NA programs, and he became a really true believer, which can seem a little strange that somebody who is this sort of like aloof and abstract and intellectual would believe in a sort of pop self-help program, which is a struggle that, again, is constantly dramatized in the novel, as you'll see, when Don Gately, one of the 2 characters who's probably the protagonist, is always thinking to himself that he doesn't understand why the program works, because how can you be asked to accept belief in a God if you don't believe in a God, just because? That was one of his big problems. And the other one is that much of the program is full of cliches, or what sound like cliches, but that somehow when you keep thinking about them, they become deeper and deeper and deeper, and they really help. And all of Don Gately's struggles with recovery in that sense were things that David Foster Wallace would oftentimes say about his own recovery from substance abuse. He was, by all accounts, through the rest of his life, a wonderful sponsor for other people in AA and NA programs. And he was really a true believer in living a substance-free life, except, and this will become important, his psychiatrist insisted that he stayed on a powerful antidepressant that he'd been taking for a lot of his life. This bothered him tremendously through much of his life because he thought that he shouldn't need any sort of drugs, even medication. I gather that that is a controversy within AA and NA circles, whether or not psychotropic medication counts as substance dependence, essentially, or health intervention. So while he's there at the house, and then for a while after, between 1990 and 1992, he very quickly pulls together most of what is Infinite Jest. It's rather remarkable that he writes a book of this size in about 2 to 2.5 years. At the same time, he's taking up an extended correspondence with a lot of writers that he's held in high esteem growing up. Don DeLillo and David Markson are two of them. And he also is writing to all of the literary critics and reporters and agents that he knows. Everybody's checking on him at this halfway house as he tells them about how he's doing and assures them that his sobriety is what is now helping him be able to write. This is also the period in which he begins a career as an accomplished essayist. It's weird. David Foster Wallace is basically two things. He is this book in people's minds, but he's also a series of like 4 or 5 really well-known essays that actually get taught as these, much smaller, more contained works. So he wrote an essay called Shipping Out that was then changed to a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again, which was when Harper's Magazine sent him on a luxury cruise to review it as travel rating. And you can see a lot of the themes of Infinite Jest's concern with overconsumption and addiction to commodity in that essay. He also wrote an essay later on called Consider the Lobster that's about, the neurology of pain that the lobsters probably feel, and it's basically a call to stop boiling things alive before you eat them. So he becomes an accomplished essayist and becomes known for that. And then in 1986, after an aggressive marketing campaign from his publisher and hype from all of the contacts that he's made in the literary world, this book comes out and it drops like a bomb into the scene. It rockets instantaneous acclaim. It's kind of amazing, too, that a book that is this big and this difficult is within 6 months in its 6th printing, as it is almost universally lauded. One of the contemporary literary critics, popular literary critics, he's written for the New York and other magazines that I admire the most, James Wood, is an exception. He thinks that the book is undisciplined and over-contrived, a judgment which I think might be at least partially fair. And Harold Bloom, a critic for whom I have less affection, but some respect, also a giant of the field, thinks that it's also uncontrolled and sloppy. But for the most part, everybody heralds him as the Wunderkind, this 30-year-old who is now instantaneously become the leader of his literary generation. And the reason that I'm focusing on the marketing is that what I do want us to understand is how much of that was constructed beforehand by a sort of publishing industry that really needed to have a new wunderkind that was going to be the person who would sort of carry the torch. So he really had a lot of help setting up this reception beforehand. Shortly after that, his second short story collection, Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, which has been made into a movie with John Krasinski from The Office, came out, and that marks the end of what Byrne would call the second phase of his career, instantaneous literary celebrity. And so the final phase of his career kind of comes after that, and how he deals with that. He's heralded as the leader of his literary generation. Authors such as Dave Eggers, Zadie Smith, and St. Louis's own Jonathan Franzen all cite him as a major inspiration in how they produce their subsequent work. And I think certainly if you've read Eggers' heartbreaking work of Staggering Genius, or Zadie Smith's White Teeth, or Franzen's, well, really a lot of Franzen books, but the corrections, certainly, you can see the influence of Wallace in a number of different ways. Really what we have to keep in mind here is that the author, as much as the book, becomes an object of cultural fascination. It's not just that Infinite Jest is an artifact in our literary imagination all of a sudden, but David Foster Wallace himself becomes this sort of like persona with this halo of all kinds of things people want to attach to him. Infinite Jest is listed by Time magazine on its way hyped best 100 books since 1923. They started in 1923 because they think that it would be unfair to start before that because James Joyce's Ulysses came out in 1922. That's important for Wallace and who he is and what this book is doing. So, it's this 30-year-old guy who wrote his second book, and a couple years after it comes out, you've got Time magazine saying that he's up there with, Faulkner and Virginia Woolf and whatnot, the usual cast of suspects that you would see on there. Hemingway is really kind of an amazing thing, but he also, with his essays and his speaking engagements, becomes this sort of like almost worshipped sort of literary saint. Shows up in his bandana and tells people that they need to sort of feel, have empathy, and be more sincere. And this really resonates with people. In this period, he also takes up an increasingly prestigious set of professorships as a creative writing professor. In the early to mid-aughts, he lands at Pomona College, where he's the Roy Disney Professor of Creative Writing, where he remained until his death. He was, by all accounts, as he was a great sponsor, a very generous teacher. Students loved him. And if you get on the old internet, you can find a number of his syllabi for different classes, and they're sort of like art objects in and of themselves, as well as also very well curated reading lists. So yeah, he's famous as a media personality, a teacher, and an AA sponsor, but in all of this, he struggles with literary productivity. Again, I've mentioned several times the sort of very introspective and sort of almost paralyzingly self-aware sense of David Foster Wallace that you can see it in the book. And this is also, it has to be said, a book which is really, really skeptical of media fame and of mass media icons. And you can think about all of the sections where tennis players, they all want to go to the show, right? Which is what happens when you become pro. And there are all these long digressions about how you think that when you become the famous tennis player worshipped all over the world, it's going to make you happy, except that you get there and you find out that all there is more pressure and emptiness, and it crushes you. This was very prescient in some ways. I'm going to suggest that he was somewhat self-consciously talking about what he was afraid was going to happen to him if the book got the reception that it did. And he did have these struggles with sort of like depression and performance because of it. He did in that period manage to write one more short story collection, Oblivion, and another work of philosophy called Everything and More. Then in 2008, he committed suicide. That was how he died. And this came after a year or two of a nasty resurgence of the major depressive disorder that he had for most of his life. He had stopped taking the antidepressant that he was on at some point against doctor's orders because he felt that he should be substance-free, and the depression came back with a vengeance. He tried every non-medicated form of therapy that he could possibly think of for a few years, and none of it was working, and he finally despaired so much that he decided he would go back on the medication because, like Kate Gumbert in the novel, he said he would feel an active sort of crushing pain that made him not want to live anymore, which is what people in major depressive orders often say. But when he went back on the medication for several months, it wasn't working. And he began to despair that he was never going to be able to make the depression go away. So he ended his own life, tragically, in 2008. But because David Foster Wallace had already become a cultural icon that was somehow unmoored from the man himself, that didn't stop the David Foster Wallace cottage industry. So after he was dead, the novel, the very long novel he had been working on, The Pale King, was published. It was not complete, but he had taken some work to compile it in such a way that people might be able to look at his notes and put it together and publish it before he died. As I said, his undergrad thesis on philosophy was published. The journalist David Lipsky, who had followed him around for the last week of his Infinite Jest tour, as it was just becoming clear how famous Wallace was going to be, finally published a book that he had not published the entire time that Wallace was alive, called Although Of Course You End Up Becoming Yourself, in 2010, which then was made into a movie with Jesse Eisenberg and Jason Segel playing David Lipsky, and you can see Jason Segel dressed up in the bandana and the glasses playing David Foster Wallace. It came out in 2015, and the literary cult of David Foster Wallace lives on. So I got a few things to say about the biography, and then we can dive into the structure of the book. Up until maybe the last 10 years, after he died, really, people would actually resist a biographical reading of Infinite Jest. For a lot of reasons that I don't know I necessarily need to go into right now, but a part of, and that tide has changed, and I want to continue to reinforce that. This is a speculative fiction novel, a sort of like quasi-sci-fi in a lot of ways, and there are many absurd elements to the plot, I'm sure everybody's going to notice. But in another way, this is an intensely autobiographical novel about his time in Boston AA. It's also in many ways a quasi-memoir of his relationship to his family, though the incandenzas have many additional fictional contrivances stacked onto real portraits of his family. So we have to think about that, and we have to think about this being in many ways the sort of what Walt Whitman would call a barbaric yop, the cry to the sky of a very intelligent, very anguished, and substance-dependent mind. Okay? And I think that that's maybe going to help us through it. Like, when you're trying to think about all of what this book is doing and what it wants from you and what's going on in it, right? This is a very intelligent, very troubled person trying to work his way through his own problems through introspection by telling you about his life. I also want to talk about, when people didn't see this biographically, this literary status that it had can sort of be paralyzing to you as a reader. And so I have three perils of literary celebrity that I wanted to make sure that we thought about. So the perils of literary celebrity, number one, I would say, is the pressure on authors when their books become great. And that's what we basically already covered with how paralyzing David Foster Wallace can be when he realizes that everybody else has this idea of who he is, but he doesn't feel like that's him, and he has to live up to it, and it can become sort of like paralyzingly crushing. This is a sort of pressure that many artists find themselves not able to live up to. But another peril of literary celebrity that I think we might want to think about is the pressure that it puts on all of you. Because when a book takes on this sort of like rarefied air of being a great, capital G, book, that is this monument of literary history that changes everything, it puts readers oftentimes in the sense of hierarchy to it. They sit below it and they sort of have to worship up at the altar. And I want to suggest that this is not a healthy attitude to have towards, really to any cultural artifact, but especially to this one, because really if you stick with it, it's more grounded and more accessible than you think it is. But you have to get past this fear that if you don't understand things that are going on, that means that there's something wrong with you. You have to get past the anxiety of not being able to put all of the pieces together. And you need to also let yourself be okay with not liking it, frankly. That doesn't mean that you have bad taste, and it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with your intellectual apparatus. This is a very difficult book. It's just, he's a really smart and troubled white dude who wrote a book. And there are a lot of really smart and troubled white dudes who did that, and there are a lot of people who weren't white dudes who did that, and there are a lot of books out there, and they do different things. And this is good in many ways, but it's not like you're a failure at reading books if you don't love this at the end of it. Or if you read it and you don't understand it. Or if you don't finish it. So don't let yourself become paralyzed by that same sort of anxiety that paralyzed him as a writer. And the third peril of literary celebrity is when authors become saints. There's been a tendency, because he became this sort of living legend even in life, and as a person who encourages us through his fiction to have a lot of empathy, and he's a person who is often loved by people who have had troubles with depression, mental health issues, and substance abuse themselves, they want to make him out to be this kind and genteel and amazing person. And he may have been. He was also a deeply troubled person in the way that people with mental health problems and deep substance abuse dependencies oftentimes are. So one of the controversies that's come out about him since he died was the women that he's known, particularly the novelist Mary Karr, who had a very tempestuous relationship with him when she herself was having her alcohol problems, talked about him having narcissistic tendencies and being potentially abusive in many ways. And while there are many people who knew him who spoke very highly of him, you can also see other people giving accounts that can show him being an incredibly demanding and in some ways self-involved person. Something else that is sort of self-consciously said in the book. And that's a part of it too. Essentially what I'm trying to say is that, especially as I've reread this, I hadn't gone through it since my fields in 8 years ago. I don't like to think about how long ago it was that I passed my orals. I'm getting old. Myself being a person who's now in my late 30s instead of my late 20s, and also living in the era that we live in, I don't think that it would be wrong to feel like this book in some ways is misogynist. And I mean that specifically, not just to say sexist, but as something that sometimes really has a sort of aggressive anger at the cultural concept of femininity. Some of what's coming out there is that the character of Joelle Van Dyne, one of the only developed female characters in the book, is by many people taken to be a stand-in for Mary Karr, the novelist he had a troubled relationship with. And that has to be there too. It's weird because I'm trying to get you all to read this book and I'm saying all that, but people even ask Mary Karr herself, they're like, well, is Wallace canceled now? And she said, no, still read it. I don't know, like there are no writers who aren't troubled figures, and so if you like it, you gotta read it. But don't feel like if you don't like the personality that's producing this book as you read it, that means there's something wrong with you, because that is also not the case. The man was human. So, is it worth it? Well, I mean, what I'm trying to, I guess, suggest to you here is that what this is a polymath genius who was a very gifted observer of human nature and a very, in some ways, empathetic soul, exploding his troubled mind across 1,200 pages. It's in many ways worth trying to delve down into his personality and see what you find, but, it's also understandable if that's not everybody's cup of tea. Okay. Literary context. So 2 terms matter here. And I do apologize for the jargon. I will try to make sure these are the only two that I use. But they are doozies. One, the encyclopedic novel. So what literary critics mean when they say this is that for several centuries, in moments of historical crisis or intense social change, authors will appear who try to write a novel that records all human knowledge about a subject. Some of the earliest examples that are cited of this are Don Quixote and a medieval French novel called Gargantua and Pantagruel. There are some other ones, but I don't need to go too alienating with the literary reference. The second term is postmodernism, a hard-to-define artistic movement occurring from 1945 to maybe now, or maybe a few years ago. Nobody's quite sure if we're still in it or not. That, unfortunately, ties its definition to another hard-to-define term, which is modernism, right? So this is our problem in 20th century studies. Everybody's like, oh, modernism, and then people are like, what the heck is that? Like, nobody's quite sure, and there's this other thing that called itself postmodernism, which just means that which is after modernism, and we don't even know what modernism is. I'm going to do my best. We'll start with the encyclopedic novel. Some examples are that people probably heard of are Moby Dick. So in this period in the late 19th century, the US is moving from being an agrarian backwater to an international industrial powerhouse, and Melville wants to record all that he can about an industry that American imperialism was founded on, whaling. I take a picture of the book.
And just to drop in here, Moby Dick was our novel last summer, so this
so everybody's read it.
So this will resonate, I think, with many of our participants, which is excellent.
I'm glad you didn't ask me to have to do the lecture on that one, because honestly, I find it more difficult in some ways. I remember I read that in grad school, and I was like, this is a ripping good sea yarn for about 200 pages, and then I was like, man, this is a lot of stuff about whaling, and then it was just about 400 pages of whaling, and then all of a sudden the ripping good sea yarn came back, but all of a sudden everybody was a symbol for Jesus, and I was a little confused as to what was going on. So I do the 20th century. Another example that everybody probably knows is James Joyce's Ulysses. This is a particularly important one for Independent Shasta and for David Foster Wallace. As World War I is ending and the Irish nation is rebelling against England for its independence, James Joyce writes a novel that he claims will form, quote, he said this, the man was not humble, a picture of Dublin so complete that if the city one day suddenly disappeared from the earth, it could be reconstructed out of my book, right? His idea was to take the day that many literary critics are euphemistic and they say that he was taking the day that he met his wife, who would become his wife. It's not the day he met who would become his wife, it's the day he consummated his relationship with the woman who would become his wife. But he took that day and he wanted to basically record every second of that day in the city of Dublin and have a novel that was Dublin on this day. Right? That's the encyclopedic impulse. Postmodernism. With apologies, I can't do this without talking about modernism for a second. It defines itself against modernism, an artistic movement from about 1900 to 1945. People also argue about the numbers there. Modernism, rapid industrialization and scientific advance, reshaped the world at the end of the 19th century more rapidly than at any point in human history, and it's not even close. Right? The world of 1850 and the world of 1900 were just fundamentally different places in any number of ways. So in the early 20th century, some artists look at mass media, expanding lifespans, global travel, massive cities that didn't exist before. I forgot to put urbanization on there, but that's one that's cited. Technological progress, and they have intense optimism. They think that, humanity's really going places. There you might think about the utopias of H.G. Wells, right? In more ugly senses, you might think about the political visions of either fascists or the USSR. So there's some dark sides that sort of like faith in the human ability to control the world can take on. Other people look at the devastation of World War I and they see a sort of dark fatalism in human nature. They think that humanity is coming to know the entire world and to control it, but that is a bad thing doomed to end in failure. And here you might think of T.S. Eliot, right? The Hollow Man, right? This is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang but a whimper, that sort of thing. But regardless of what kind of modernist you are, they basically all share a sense that humanity does have a nature that is knowable, whether it's good or bad, right? And that the world is knowable and comprehensible, and can be empirically understood and controlled. And they have this sort of like faith in human reason and science. Postmodernism comes after 1945, and the general reading of what happened here is that the world had seen its second World War in 30 years, right? After the war to end all wars, the one that was supposed to form an international order that was going to keep the world safe from now on. That war dwarfed the previous scale of human atrocity of World War I, which had already dwarfed any previous scale of human atrocity. And it's not just the scale of death that happened in World War II, but it's horrors like the Holocaust, right? Things so hideously irrational that they showed the deep capacity of human malice, cruelty, and insanity. All of which was ended by the good guys of the war unleashing a weapon on the world, which had now escalated to a Cold War situation where humanity lived under a constant threat of total self-annihilation because of perhaps a bureaucratic error. We can think of movies like Dr. Strangelove, right? So to writers at this point, human reason seems tenuous, flawed, and weak. But at the same time, that they have much less faith in the human capacity to sort of understand really anything. The world is still modernizing at an even faster pace than it did in the period of modernism. So the world has become hyper-connected. Air travel brings us all together. Superstates like NATO and the EU begin to form. Transnational capitalism becomes a thing where corporations are no longer really located within single countries, but they sort of span the world. You can go to a McDonald's in Moscow at the height of the Cold War. Transnational capitalism, Cold War, yeah. And then eventually the internet, which puts all of the information of the world at your fingertips. And so we have the postmodern encyclopedic novel. This is actually a genre, I didn't make this up, but one of the things that people notice about post-45 American literature is that there's this tendency over and over and over again for people to write these giant encyclopedic novels. Infinite Jest is only one of the most recent within this trend, and he's very self-aware of the fact that he's coming in this tradition. In this new moment of crisis, several encyclopedic novels emerged that sort of satirize this modernist idea of total human knowledge, which is to say that they stuff themselves full of information on a whole wide range of discourses and fields of inquiry, high and low, scientific knowledge, but also comic books or show tunes. But they also give you the sense that no matter how much knowledge you ever manage to amass, you're never really actually going to understand the world or your place in it. They're deeply cynical about that concept. According to English professors, the novel has always been about trying to replicate human experience. You read books to sort of like understand how people live in the world. The idea of this type of novel is to say the human condition in the modern America is information overload, paranoia, confusion, fear of apocalypse, shallow consumerism, and the constant worry that you're somehow the butt of history's joke on humanity. Okay? It's cheery stuff. Two books that I'm thinking of here there are dozens I could mention, but the two major ones for Infinite Jest and for most people's literary cosmology are a book called Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon, a book about which I have written a great deal, and Don DeLillo's novel Underworld, which actually comes out shortly after Infinite Jest, but Wallace had taken up a literary friendship with DeLillo and had been reading and commenting on drafts of the book while he was working on Infinite Jest. Just circling back to the problem of literary celebrity, I would say a part of why Infinite Jest became the thing that it became is that the literary agents and publishing industry of the world found themselves in a bit of a pickle, and that the pantheon of post-45 American writers, you could probably say, I think most people would agree that the big four were Pynchon, DeLillo, Toni Morrison, and Philip Roth, all of whom were born in the 1930s, all of whom by the 1990s are starting to get up there. We still have DeLillo and Pynchon with us. Pynchon, I think we would know if he died. He's very reclusive. Sadly, we don't have Roth or Morrison, but people were starting to wonder. Pynchon especially had slowed down, but some of the other ones did. People didn't know how many more books we were going to get from them. As it interestingly turns out, all four of them actually entered renewed periods of literary productivity in the 90s, which might have something to do with them wanting to guard their own sense of their legacy. But the question, if you're a person who runs a publishing industry that is already beset by declining sales, is who are we going to sell as the next literary genius? And this 30-year-old wunderkind comes along with this book that very self-consciously tries to position itself as something that is these kinds of book. And it's like catnip, they can't resist it. And that's where the hype machine kind of comes in. He came in at exactly the right moment to sort of alleviate everybody's anxieties about who the next Pynchon was going to be, basically. I probably won't get into it that much when we discuss this book, but it's worth noting too that not Underworld itself, because again it wasn't out, but DeLillo's fiction, Gravity's Rainbow, and Joyce's Ulysses are constantly referenced throughout Infinite Jest, in a lot of ways that are both explicit, if you've read those books, and also more subtle. Since I assume that many people will not have read those books, I don't want to get into that much, but I do want us to understand that the reason I'm telling you all of this is that David Foster Wallace, an English professor, knows all of the history that I just gave you, and is very much thinking about trying to make himself out to be a person who exists in conversation with these authors. So all of these books have some key features, and really this goes across all postmodern encyclopedic novels, and hopefully we can see some ways that Infinite Jest is doing all of these things. So, one of the features, they're massive. They're big doorstops of books. Gravity's Rainbow is 760 pages, Underworld is 825, and Infinite Jest tips those Toledos at a whopping 1,079 pages. Although I guess you can say that 200 pages of it is footnotes, but it still comes in at, I think, 980, even without that. They're also incredibly dense. They have a wide range of scientific and cultural knowledge. They expect you to be able to follow along to the discussions of calculus and trigonometry, pharmaceuticals, rocketry in Gravity's Rainbow, with organic chemistry in Gravity's Rainbow and Infinite Jest, with tennis strategy as a big part of it is David Foster Wallace. They bring in all of these really obscure fields of knowledge that they say everything they can say about. They have huge casts of characters, all of whom seem like they're not connected at all. And it's very difficult to follow why you're even looking at who all of these people are, except as you continue to read, there all starts to be all of these ways that you see that they all exist in some sort of loose social network. So you have that thing, especially in a city like St. Louis, where you're talking to a person and they're like, oh, you know so-and-so, I know so-and-so, how did you know so-and-so? Oh, we were at this place. And you're like, oh my God, we must have walked by each other at that show and we didn't even know we were there. Right? These books basically dramatize that. By having all of these characters who don't have anything to do with each other, except they all kind of do in the sense that they all exist in this network. All of these books will always have sinister international political conspiracies. There's this sense that in the Cold War and now since after, that there's some sort of sinister cabal of government agents and businesses that are probably controlling how things go in the world, and you can kind of see them, but not quite. This is always dramatized through these books. This is a key thing. Every one of them has a MacGuffin. Do we know what a MacGuffin? Okay.
I'm not familiar with the term, no.
The MacGuffin, actually Alfred Hitchcock's term, and he was talking about film. And what Hitchcock was talking about is films that have an object that is basically the narrative motivation of the film, but is actually irrelevant in itself. It's the thing that everybody wants, but what it is doesn't really matter. So his example would be the Maltese Falcon, from the Maltese Falcon. But other examples we can think of, if anybody watches these Marvel movies, right, there's always this thing where there's these stones they have to get through all those 18 movies, right? And in each new movie, there's a new stone, and a bad guy's going to get it, and if the bad guy's going to get it, it's going to do some vague thing, but it isn't totally clear what. And the point is, it doesn't matter what the stone is or what the stone's going to do. The stone is just the thing that gives a reason for the good guys and the bad guys to punch each other, right?
Like the Ark of the Covenant.
Like the Ark of the Covenant. Like in Indiana Jones, yes, exactly, exactly. Maybe a more sort of appropriate to Infinite Jest example is Quentin Tarantino's film Pulp Fiction, which is very postmodern in the 90s, and it's similar to what Infinite Jest is doing in some ways, where everybody's after this suitcase that they open up, and anybody opens it up, and you always see it from behind, so you never see what's in the case. Mm-hmm. But they open it up, and then their faces glow, because whatever's in there glowing, and people look at it and go, oh my God, is that what I think it is? And you never find out what it is. But Tarantino's point is that, it doesn't matter, right? It's the MacGuffin. It's the thing that just moves the story around. They've all got this. In Gravity's Rainbow, all of these different international corporations are trying to find the first V2 rocket that was tested somewhere for different reasons. In DeLillo's novel Underworld, there's this baseball from a consequential, famous baseball game in 1951 that everybody's trying to, but it's famously been lost to history. And it shows up in the novel, and somebody claims it's the ball, and so people are trying to trace its history back and figure out, if it is the ball. Mm-hmm. And in Infinite Jest, of course, the MacGuffin, David Foster Wallace would call it a MacGuffin sometimes in interviews, more than once. I found this in my research when I was going back through interviews. There is the film Infinite Jest.
Yeah.
Right? Made by James Owen Candenza, the deceased father figure who sort of haunts the entire book, almost literally, you'll find when we get to the end, who has made a film that is so entertaining that a person who watches it loses the will to do anything but watch the film over and over and over again until they die. And everybody wants this film for different reasons, and it sort of moves the plot around. But again, remember, I cannot stress this enough, that's only incidental to whatever these stories are oftentimes doing. Okay? Mass media and pop culture. So as highbrow as these books can be with scientific and cultural knowledge, they're also very much into television and commercials and cartoons and comic books and show tunes and stuff like that. This is pretty new. Joyce maybe was unique among the modernists in that he tended to talk about the popular culture of his time, but you know, most modernists were sort of famously are understood to be a little bit too snooty to want to deal with that kind of stuff. They want to talk about the ancient Greeks and the Latins and sort of like obscure Provençal romantic poets. They don't want to talk about newspaper clippings. That's actually not at all a fair thing to say about the modernists, but that's, I think a lot of them are actually much more engaged with popular culture, people are realizing, but in general that is the way they've been understood for a very long time. Going along with this, novels, and you're definitely going to see this in Infinite Jest, are very, very coarse. They're concerned with basically, if what they're trying to do is represent what it's like to be an everyday person in the world right now, and be unflinching and catalog everything that goes on, a lot of the banality and messiness of everyday life is going to include addiction, sexuality, bodily processes like eating and defecation, sort of desires and frustrations of that. This, I think, could actually be one of the hardest things about this book, other than its difficulty, is that a lot of the time when you're reading the character sketches, David Foster Wallace is dramatizing the struggles of hardcore drug addicts, which are people that he knew and he talked to a lot, and these can be very disturbing and ugly lives. But they're lives that he thinks are worth chronicling, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, and so these books make a point of not pulling back from talking about that kind of stuff. I'm sorry, I have one more very critical term I forgot. They're metafictional. And what meta means, people say that now, right? That the kids say that. Oh, that's meta. What metafictional means is that it's fiction that thinks about fiction. So, like, anytime that you see people, like, watching a movie in a movie, that probably, when the way that people talk about the movie they're watching is supposed to be a commentary on the film itself. He does the same thing. They think about how fiction tries and fails to represent our lives. And a few things that you probably want to think about, the two major sort of like metafictional devices in this book are, I would say, tennis and film. So the film specifically of James Owen Candenza. So whenever he starts talking about like the theory of tennis, what you should probably try to keep in mind is that what he's actually talking about is what David Foster Wallace, is trying to do as a writer. So I already said a little bit of this before, when they're all obsessed about trying to get to the show, and then they worry about whether or not it'll ruin them to get to the show, that's David Foster Wallace thinking about himself as a writer and very celebrity. When people start discussing the theory of James Owen Candenza's films, they're oftentimes actually discussing the theory of how this book is put together. So in Candenza made films that are called anti-confluential, is a term that gets used in the book, by which they seem to mean there's no confluence, things kind of fall apart and they're ragged at the edges and all of the parts don't come together. Well, that's this book. This book is written the way that Candenza's films are. For my money, one of the most hilarious scenes in the book, when they're watching this sort of like, what's supposed to be a parody of grindhouse movies that Candenza made, where there's a former heroin-addicted woman gets saved by an order of warrior nuns who take up street addicts and get them clean and then train them to become warrior nuns. And it goes into this whole sort of like satire of grindhouse films where she has to fight all these biker gangs and stuff, and she's like hitting them with a censer. And he starts talking about how Candenza is making this film because he wants to satirize pop culture, but that at the same time he's worried that maybe he loves pop culture too much and he's actually just making pop culture. That's David Foster Wallace telling you that he's trying to critique mass media at the same time that he kind of loves mass media. He hates television, but he loves television. Much like he hates drugs, but he loves drugs, right? He views television as a drug. And he worries that he might be sort of like indulging himself in the things that he's trying to criticize. And finally, all of these books involve central characters who lose identity over the course of the book. They kind of come undone. And in this book, we can see that with Hal and Candenza, and you actually get clued into that at the beginning, where you find out that after most of the events of the story, something has happened to him. What happened to him is something we can probably talk about after everybody's read further through, but it's highly debatable. It's given him some kind of nervous breakdown so that he has literally lost the ability to be understood. He still thinks in these incredibly intelligent senses. When he talks, it just makes this ghastly sort of rictus and noise that terrifies everybody around him, and he's lost the ability to communicate with the world. Okay. In other words, I'm trying to like bring this back down and make this more easy now at this point. The paradox of the information age is the more that we know, the less anything seems to make sense. I don't have an audience to ask, but this is the moment I want participation. But you know that thing, I don't think that this is just a millennial thing, I think this happens to everybody. Like you go on Wikipedia because you want to know one thing, and then it mentions another thing, and it's got the link. You're a librarian, I know you do this, right? And you're like, oh, what's that? I want to know about that, and you click that thing, and then it tells you about this other thing, and you're like, huh. And you go, and you start tracing out, and you wind up, like, all of a sudden it's 2 hours later, and you've gone 15 links deep, and you can't even remember what it was that you initially started, like, looking for, but now you understand that there's, like, 20 more things that you didn't know anything about that you feel like you need to understand to be a responsible person, and you're mostly just sort of, like, confused and exhausted. Okay. Hopefully everybody knows that feeling. Hopefully you know that feeling.
I know that feeling.
This book is intending to dramatize that feeling. That's what I've been saying. David Foster Wallace knows that feeling, and the book is intended to sort of like mimic that structure in the way that it works. So yeah, I got here early. Infinite Jest, the metafictional devices are Tennyson films. And so I want us to think about two quotes where he tells you what he's trying to do with this book, and then we can get to the plot summary. One of them is on page 82. This is where he's talking about the theory of tennis. The locating beauty and art of match play is not a matter of reducing chaos to pattern. It was not a matter of reduction at all, but, perversely, of expansion. Each well-shot ball admitting of n possible responses, 2 n possible responses to those responses, and on, into this infinity of infinities of choice and execution. Which is to say, oddly, the more interconnected the world becomes, and the more information you have access to, the more you realize you don't understand what's going on. Every time you go to answer one question, you wind up with 2 more questions. And you go to answer those 2 questions, and you wind up with 4 questions. Right? And on and on and on and on and on and on, out into an infinity of confusion.
Just because I'll forget if I try to ask at the end.
Yeah.
That quote, and I'm not very far in the book, makes me also think a lot about linguistic theory, which I'm sure Foster Wallace was well acquainted with, and even conversation and the infinitely generative nature of human language. You know, you lob a ball across at somebody and something unpredictable will come back.
Yes, exactly. That's I guess the other thing I can think of in the way that you just described lobbing the ball and the way it can come back is that this is also it's the mathematical theory about how there's not an infinite number of chess games. I guess what somebody's calculated out. There's like more variations of a chess game than there are like particles in the universe or something like that, right? Because like one move has so many other moves that can respond, and there's so many iterations of it. And like that's what he's saying. The more you study, the more empty it becomes. Yeah, conversation is the same way. I think that's a really smart point, Kathleen, because a lot of what's wrapped up with postmodern novels is something called postmodern theory that I'm doing my best not to talk about at all, is these largely French philosophers who were writing in the 1960s and the 1970s about all of the ways that the sort of scientific positivisms of the early 20th century, these scientific beliefs that we could actually understand everything, always pull themselves apart. And one of the ways that they see that is that they're really obsessed with language and how basically thought without language is impossible. We're all constrained by our language. We can only think what our language allows us to think. If that seems hard, you can think about, I think, George Orwell, where in 1984, the point is that the government wants to sort of reduce people's vocabularies because that reduces their ability to express their ideas. Post-structuralists point out that, as you're saying, when you say one thing and somebody has infinite ways, or has any number of ways to respond, and then you have any number of responses to each of the responses, it does that same sort of fractalizing, and you can never know how a conversation is going to go. You become lost in language. Yes. Absolutely, and that's a fundamental part, and that's why when people criticize these books, do literary criticism on these books, they bring in those philosophers all the time, and they talk about that and how it's working. David Foster Wallace actually claimed that he was trying to get away from that sort of like tendency within literature. Personally, I feel that he did not get so far away from all of that as he thought he did. There's some critical controversy there. I think actually more people would want to say that he did, and less people would agree with me, but some people would agree with me. Yeah, thanks for that. And the other quote that I've got is here, where Hal is describing a nightmare, a recurring nightmare he has about a tennis match. It's like a tennis match like Dante's Hell, where there are thousands of courts that intersect each other in all of these different directions, and lines going in different places, and nets at different angles, and stadiums sort of like overhanging him in all sorts of crazy angles and directions with people sitting at them. And there seem to be all kinds of rules that actually govern how all of this is supposed to work, but he doesn't know any of them. And he's standing there in his gear with his racket, right? So this is one of those, like, you know, show up to class naked anxiety dreams, right? But with this sort of massive tennis game that he has to play against an invisible opponent. And he ends describing this dream to the person he's talking to by saying, "The umpire whispers, 'Please play.' We sort of play, but it's all hypothetical somehow. Even the we is theory. I never quite get to see the distant opponent for all of the apparatus of the game." The deal with these, well, here, I think I've got a better way to say it. Okay. The world according to Infinite Jest. We come into life in the middle of a game that preceded us. There seem to be rules to the game, but they're so impossibly complex that we can't understand the rules. We know we're supposed to be playing the game, but we don't know what the game is. People we care about are spectating and seem to expect us to do something, and so we flail about with no idea of what we're doing. That would be, I think, the postmodern take on human existence. When you're trying to make meaning out of one of these books, you can go deep, like the sort of like Wikipedia vortex, in trying to understand them. And you should, to some extent, take it as far as you want to go, because a part of the fun of reading one of these books, I'm going to suggest, is the new things that you learn trying to understand them. I really, really, really want to caution you against the idea that there's some way that you are going to make all of the ends pull together and make this book make sense. And the reason for that is that this is a book where maybe the point, if it has a point, is that you can't do that with this book or with anything else. And so you can see people try to do this with all these kinds of books, certainly with Infinite Jest. I think one of the other librarians was just telling me they found a picture of the book where someone just did a read-through of the book where they found every single reference to color. And they put a post-it note of the color that was mentioned in the book to see if they could discover some pattern. People get very much in this sort of like a beautiful mind or like conspiracy theorist mode where you got like the string and the pictures and everything to try and like find the structure. And a lot of critics agree with me, some disagree with me, but like the point here is that they want you to let go of that. What they're saying about the world is that like you want to sort of like make it all make sense, make all the ends of your life come together, but that's just not what's going to happen. And if you go through your life that way, you'll drive yourself crazy. And so they give you books where if you are going to manage to get through the book, you have to let go of those impulses, and you have to learn to sort of like live with it in a different sort of way. Okay. Plot and structure. I just got like 4 slides here where I'm just going to try and explain like what nominally is like going on in the book. It's because that can actually be really hard to follow.
Right.
I want us to be able to follow that. I've got 2 slides about the world of Infinite Jest. So this is like a sort of speculative fiction. He's writing a quasi-science fiction book that's set in like a near future from when he's writing in the mid-90s. So it's set in the not-too-distant future from 1986 when it's published. He starts writing at 90, but whatever, in that period. James Owen Candenza has helped discover cold fusion that has solved the world's energy needs, but it also produces massive waste. This is before he founds a tennis academy and then becomes a famous avant-garde filmmaker. The US president, who's a Vegas showman and popular media personality with no political experience whatsoever, who manages to win on the basis of a crass populism by pulling together people who feel disenfranchised from the left and the right by making obscene promises about how he'll do absurd things like hurtle trash into space. No analogies to the president are intended, but that's who the president is. And so he wins on this absurd promise that he's going to make the country so clean you can eat off the sidewalk. And he does this by forcing Canada and Mexico, basically forcing the NAFTA states, into an EU-style superstate that's called ONAN, the Organization of North American Nations. But of course the joke that we're meant to see here is that the acronym ONAN is a reference to onanism, which is masturbation. And this being a book that's about self-gratification, he's made his country that everybody lives in name itself after self-gratification, the originary act of self-gratification. So he forms ONAN, and once he's formed it, what he decides he's going to do is dump all the toxic waste of the country into New England with massive catapults that they have in Boston that are launching it up into like Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire. This is all presented so abstractly and so matter-of-factly that I think it can be difficult when you're reading it to understand that something this absurd is being described. But what they're talking about is how you can hear the catapults going all day and night, like through Boston, as they're launching all of their garbage into New England that they've turned into a toxic waste dump, which is now full of, all sorts of rumored hideous deformities, babies that have been left there that grow and grow and grow but never mature and become giant, feral, room-sized infants, and all sorts of other sort of atrocities that supposedly live out there. And he fulfills his promise to keep the U.S. clean. And he said he wants to keep the U.S. clean, but then he sort of like pollutes all of New England like beyond habitability. But the trick that he pulls is he forces Canada, with America's power within the organization, to take the territory off of their hands, so it's not part of America anymore. At the same time, because he can tell them what to do, because they're all one country now, he makes them lease the land back to the United States so that they can use it as a toxic waste dump, and then he can claim that the United States is a completely waste-free and clean country by destroying the country next door. And again, you can draw your own sorts of political analogies there if you want to. The problem is that he has to pay for having lost all of that territory, and he manages to pay for the US losing basically all of New England by the brilliant idea of subsidizing time, where every year gets bidded out to the corporations of the world so that they get to name the year. So that now, instead of it being 2004, it would be the year of the Whopper, or the year of the tox-medicated pad, and so forth. And we have 9 years of subsidized time so far in the book, and they're laid out for you at one point. This can become a great point of confusion for people because it can begin to become difficult to figure out which year we're in because they don't have numbers. I'll help you with that in a second. This sort of like disputed territory, but it's an interesting territorial dispute because it's a territorial dispute where nobody wants the territory. Right? Usually nations fight over who owns the territory, like the Crimea or whatever, but now they're fighting because they don't want the territory. New England is called to Americans the Great Concavity, and to Canadians the Great Convexity, and it becomes a major political issue. So Quebecois separatists, who have heretofore been rebelling against Canada violently, now shift their terrorism against the US, or ONAN, against having to live next to this toxic fallout. All right, that's the world. The plot, such as there is a plot. James Owen Candenza became an experimental filmmaker late in life, and his last film, Infinite Jest, is lethally entertaining. So again, when somebody watches this, it ruins their ability to do anything but want to watch the film over and over and over again. And even if you take the film away, they seem to have basically become a vegetable who only wants the film. Nobody seems to survive this condition for very long. And if they do, they're not happy. Shortly after he finishes it, and before the book really takes up its action, he's committed suicide. You only see in Candenza in living form a couple times in the book. A Quebecois separatist group called, my French is bad, Les Assassins de Fatih Roland, I think, the AFR, which means the wheelchair assassins. They're all bound to wheelchairs for reasons that get explained later in the book that I can go through and question if we want to, but there is a reason for it, but it's absurd. Seeks the entertainment, that's what Infinite Jest is called, as a terrorist weapon that they're going to use against ONAN, so that they can try to get their separatist movement started. And then the ONAN equivalent of the CIA, it gets its own acronym, is also seeking the entertainment because they want to stop the AFR from using it as a device to sort of destabilize Onanite society. And the machinations of each of these organizations are going to eventually wind up pulling together all of James Owen Candenza's family and the tennis academy that he founded, the Enfield Tennis Academy, as well as Ennet House, the halfway house, which happens to be down the hill. And through this almost Dickensian, Charles Dickens, like weird contrivance of like really unbelievable coincidences, everybody who's involved with how this film got out into the world somehow winds up either at the tennis academy or at the halfway house, which happens to be down the hill. And you watch as the Onin CIA and the AFR both start to gradually figure this out over the course of the book. And they start to have their machinations to get there in a race to kidnap the characters that you've been reading about so they can find out where the entertainment, or the samizdat is the other thing people call it, which is a word for a banned book, where the samizdat is. Okay, well, basically then, in a way, there's actually a sort of like absurd potboiler spy novel in this book. And so when, like, for instance, we have James Owen Candenza's film that's like making fun of 70s grindhouse films, but then worried that he likes them too much and he's losing the ability to parody them. That's going on here, where we have this like crazy sort of spy novel that is overrun, and I mean overrun, through a sea of this sort of like modernist experimentation with representing the consciousness of drug addicts, to the point that like that plot kind of just gets buried. But it's there. Some obstacles, some technical obstacles to understanding the book. Because of subsidized time, it can be hard to follow the chronology of events, but it's actually a lot easier if I just tell you a couple of things right now that you can go ahead and keep in mind. You figure them out as you read if you're really paying attention, but I'm just going to tell you because, I don't know, maybe that's cheating, but I think that he could make it easier than he does. The first chapter, which takes place in the year of Glad, is chronologically, in terms of the story's time, is the last chapter. It's the last event to happen in the story. So that means that everything that happens after the first chapter is basically a flashback. So you have Hal have this disastrous interview when he's trying to get into college at the University of Arizona, and then everything that happens before is either in his senior year of high school or memories taken before that. Keep that in mind if you read it. One of the other things that you can notice, if you want to try and find out what the relationship of all of these years is to each other and when they all take place, I can cut through all of that. Like 80-90% of the book takes place in the year of the Depend adult undergarment,
Yep.
which gets acronymized as what acronymized? Is that a word?
It should be.
It's YDAU. By the way, that's 2009. And if we don't get to how I know that, like I can get into the critical arguments that have established it, but you can know pretty clearly that the year is 2009. Okay. Some people could go between 2008 and 2011, depending on how you, but anyway, if that's the kind of thing you feel like you need to know, that's there. Specifically, it even happens at 2 points. It happens in, the action is taking place in April, May of the year of the Depend adult undergarment, and that's when this AFR agent and this CIA agent, who are double agents and talking to each other, are having this long conversation about what the entertainment is and where it came from and why they want it, and it keeps checking back in on this conversation that they're having, where you also get, and that's where a lot of the plot gets revealed if you care about the plot. At the same time, Orin Incandenza, the oldest brother in the Incandenza family, is calling his younger brother Hal and talking to him about a woman who's writing a magazine profile of him, which winds up being connected to what's going on with the spies. It's pretty funny what happens. I don't know if I should worry about spoilers here, but I can't. With a book like this, I don't know if it matters, but there's a big twist there. But that's all happening in April, May, and then most of the action really is even in October, November, where there's this couple weeks in the fall of Hal's senior year, and when everything kind of goes south. Any other time that's happening is before this, so there's your chronology for you, and the reason that it's happening is it's meant to be giving you background information about what's going on with the characters in these two main moments of action. Okay. And so if you just want to keep in mind, just remember these are your two main periods, and just look at the month dates. You don't have to worry about the year. Just look at, is it April 1st or is it May? Is it April 30th or May 1st or whatever? What I'm saying is, there's an absurd sort of potboiler spy plotline hidden in this book, but the plot's hidden because the plot is the MacGuffin. It's not the point of the story, it's just what gives you the occasion for the story. It's what makes all these characters move around, but what this book cares about is the characters. And you can tell because that's what it spends all of its time talking about. When screenwriters map out like how three-act structures are supposed to work, you have what's called the expository stage, right, where all of the characters who are main characters, exposition, right, they get introduced, the settings are established, the main sorts of like terms of the story are laid out before the rising action begins. It's supposed to be about like maybe 20-25% of the beginning of the story. This is a book that has basically 500 pages of exposition before that plot really even gets rolling, so to say. Clearly a person who writes a book that way isn't really all that concerned with the plot. The plot basically disappears behind hundreds of pages detailing the life stories of minor characters and 200 pages of digressive footnotes about the world that the characters live in. And what Wallace is trying to tell you is that the plot isn't really the point. Okay, I have an anecdote about how I became an English teacher. As I told you, I don't want to go back in the slides, but I have done some work on this other notorious artifact of literary culture called Gravity's Rainbow, which is a book that occupies the same sort of status of sort of like difficulty and literary greatness that Infinite Jest does in a lot of ways. I read that when I was 20, I want to say, or maybe 21, when I was in college at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And the reason I wanted to pick up Pynchon is that he was this figure who had all of these sorts of like weird jokes that would pop up in pop culture sometimes. I would see references to him, and I didn't know what it meant. And whenever I asked anybody what it meant, they'd be like, oh, you just got to read it. I don't know. So it was, do you know the show, the John Larroquette show, the guy who was on that show, Night Court, and he had his own show, and it takes place in St. Louis, actually, at Union Station, where he's running the bus depot out of there.
I've never seen it, but
he's a big Pynchon fan, so there's an episode of that show where one of the characters is a sort of unhoused person who sleeps in the bus station. They're there all the time. The bus station's clock stops. Or no, I'm sorry, the bus station's clock that has been stopped for like 20 years starts working all of a sudden. And everybody freaks out. And John Larroquette, who's the new manager of the bus station, is like, why is everybody freaking out? What is this about? And it turns out that the backstory of the unhoused person who sleeps on the bench is that they came to meet their lover that they were going to elope with 20 years ago. And they're supposed to meet at a particular time. But the clock stopped 5 minutes before the person was supposed to come. And the person never showed up. And the person sat there waiting, thinking that when the time came, when the clock moved again, the person was going to show up. And it never had. And so they've just been there. And the clock is moving again. And now everybody's like, is this person going to show up? A side part of this episode is that Larroquette is bonding with the clerk in his office about how they both like Thomas Pynchon. So at the end of the episode, everybody in the entire station has stopped working, and they're all standing there and they're looking at this clock as it counts down to like where the time is going to be. And he comes out and he yells at everybody, well, all of you get back to work. This is so dumb. So-and-so's ex-girlfriend isn't going to show up. And his clerk looks over at him and says, and you call yourself a Pynchon fan? My parents started laughing hilariously. And I was like, what does that mean? What does that mean? And they're like, you have to read Gravity's Rainbow. I was like, okay. So I was like 20, and I went and I get this book off the shelf, and it's 800 pages long. And I start reading it, and it wants me to understand the history of how the Nazis built faster than sound rockets in concentration camps in Denmark, and to understand the calculus for how rockets fly, and the pharmacology of drugs. And I do not get this book. I told myself I was going to do it. I'm also an English major, and I'm like, I need this to be my first literary project. Like, I'm going to do this. I start like researching. That's a big deal for me. I don't know, I'm a 20-year-old, and like I could be at parties on the beach, and I'm like, I'm going to find these things. They're going to explain this book to me, and I'm just not getting it. Right? I'm hating it. I spend like a year. I'm reading on planes every time I go home. I'm like falling asleep. I'm having to go back and read stuff I read again, but it's not making any more sense. There's references to astrology. I'm like, what is this about? The only thing that's sustaining me is, if we're being uncharitable, intellectual vanity. And if you're being more charitable, this is more charitable, if this is a stubborn person. And I'm like, this is not going to beat me. I'm going to get this. I'm smart. I can do this. But it's really not helping. And so I'm slogging through it. And about 200 pages in, I remember when it finally clicks for me. A huge focus on the book, even more than Infinite Jest, is paranoia. And he talks about paranoia all the time, all these paranoid characters, and these people who think that there are all these conspiracies afoot. The book takes place at the end of World War II. And the problem is that a lot of the conspiracies are real, right? And real not just in the book, but historically real. But some of them aren't. And no one can tell which is which. And they're paranoid all the time, and they don't know. And so everybody's running around trying to see, looking for the plot, and it's always capital P. And I realized, I had this flash. I was on an airplane. And I was like, all of these characters I've been reading about for 200 pages are these confused people looking for the plot. And I'm reading this book, and I'm looking for the plot. Right? And it just clicked all of a sudden. I was like, oh my God, could that just be what this is? Like, is this dude just making a stupid plot? Like, is this just a practical joke that he's playing on me? No, I mean a practical joke, because it's like, you know, as it turned out, I think it's one of those jokes, like the AA slogans, has depth to it once you go further through it. You know, what I realized he was trying to do then was to get me to let go of this idea that things have to make sense. I had learned a lot about the history of World War II. I had learned a lot about German philosophy and its relationship to occultism. I had learned a lot of history about the US and about what the FBI and the CIA were up to in the 1960s and the 1970s, trying to understand this book. I had also pursued all of these digressions that he goes on, where he's got these like long philosophical conversations between people, and they bring up these really sorts of deep conversations about the nature of free will and language. And I realized that like all of that had been enriching me. Like all of that was an experience. And all of that is stuff that you can get if you just let go of having to think that the book totally makes sense and you're getting the point. And I realized that if I could just sort of ease up, the book was teaching me how to read it while I read it. It was this breakthrough moment, and I began to read it with greater and greater interest and more understanding as I went through it. And, you know, I finished it, and I got to the end, and then I opened it up and went back to the first page, because I realized now I have to go back through and try to understand the thing again. And I did, and, you know, for better or for worse, that damaged my brain sufficiently that I wound up becoming an English PhD who wrote about Thomas Pynchon and authors like him. But what I want to say is that I would encourage everyone to try and have that same sort of openness, what poet John Keats called negative capability, that he said that Shakespeare and other geniuses have had, which is the comfortableness to be confused, to be okay with not understanding, and to just open yourself to the information that comes in, find whatever enjoyment that you can, or stimulation intellectually, and see where it goes. And don't worry so much about trying to make everything into a single and coherent meaning. Okay, last section. Okay. So please recall that novels like this are metafiction. They're fiction about how fiction works. Infinite Jest is telling you that if you read the book for a point, you're missing the point. If novels should represent life, our lives don't have clear singular points, and they don't follow narrative arcs, right? Every film has this 3 stages of a beginning and rising action and falling action and climax and then a denouement that sets the new routine. Your life doesn't work that way. You can make your life work that way, and we do oftentimes, right? When someone's like, oh, what's the story of how you did something? And you're like, well, let me tell you. And then you take all of your experience and you make it into one of these arcs. But what these post-45 novels are saying is that that's artificial. You have to make up a stop point, you have to make up an end point, and you have to filter out all of the information that doesn't matter, and you have to elevate information which may have seemed incidental at the time. It's just not the way that we go through the world. And so if we're trying to write books that help us see the way that we inhabit the world, which again is what we say a fiction is supposed to do, we need to get rid of that sort of sense of tidiness and of tied-up ends. So with Infinite Jest, you can analyze the text with a microscope and try to connect the dots and pull a meaning out. And people do that. Right? You can find all kinds of critics who are trying to do that. But what I'm going to tell you is that whatever meaning that they come to, it's not the meaning. And that's okay. Because again, much like life, I mean, we have, who knows how many religions in the world, how many philosophical systems, how many political ideologies are the people who think that they've put all of the information of the world into a map. How do you say which one's right? Wallace is highly self-conscious about AA cliches that seem to have deeper meaning for him. But so here's one, right? And he says this throughout the book, right? About how like one day at a time and all that. What does that even mean? How can you say there's a higher power if I don't even know if there's a God? You want me to believe in a God just to believe in a God? He found that ridiculous. Yet he had to do it for the program. And he wound up being an evangelist of it. So here's one. It's about the journey, not the destination. This is about the process of reading. It's not about where we're going to end. Which is to say that the obstacles to reducing the novel to a clear plot line are the point. The book is about what you think and feel on the way to finishing it, not understanding what the whole meaning of the story was. Very long digressions into the background of character. Okay, so here's a partial list of some things that make the book hard. 1. We have very long digressions into the background of characters whose purpose in the story isn't clear until hundreds of pages later. So you'll get a 30-page like episode that goes deep into the psychology of what's going on in a person's life, and then that character will not be mentioned again for 300 pages. And then when they do come back and they wind up, they play some important but incredibly minor role in the nominal plot that keeps the spy plot that keeps this book moving. They show up for a minute, they do something, and they leave. They're like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in Hamlet. The bit players who themselves were traumatized in Tom Stoppard's play, where he thinks to himself, like, well, what is it like to be these guys who are just on the periphery of this grand sort of Shakespearean tragedy? You know? He's, like Stoppard, he is giving voice to the minor characters. The digressions are often written in the voice of the character, so another thing that a lot of these books, not all postmodern books, but a lot of them do, and that he does, and he is legitimately a master at this, is he alters his prose style into the voice of different people, so that you can tell like which characters are talking in many ways when he is thinking through their dialects. That can make comprehension difficult for people who are trying to read it and figure out what's going on. There's a lot of drug slang from Boston in the 90s, among other things. And there's the footnotes. The footnotes. There's 200 pages of footnotes. Some of the footnotes have footnotes. Some people would want to say, there are people who even argue about whether or not they're absolutely essential to the reading. The thing I would say is that really a lot of them feel like they're almost arbitrarily there. They're giving you information about stuff that I'm not even clear why he wants to give you that information, especially when he doesn't give you other information that seems relevant about other things. But then every once in a while, one of these footnotes will wind up divulging like absolutely fundamental details about a character or the plot. If you want to know which ones you really have to pay attention to, generally, you know that you need to pay attention to the ones that are several pages long. But specifically, there will be some that are excerpts from the magazine article that the reporter is writing about Warren and Cadenza. That's where a lot of the plot actually rolls out. And there are also, towards the end of the book, there are actually 2 whole chapters that he puts in footnotes for reasons we can talk about. People argue about why. But anyway, so those big long ones, but really look out for places where it's either talking about James Owen Cadenza's film career or where it's talking about the magazine article. What they do is they force you to read the text non-linearly. In a way, it's like the Wikipedia hyperlinking and clicking around. And he's writing this at the beginning of the information age. And when people asked him why he did this, it's because he said that he wanted people to not read books linearly, which is when you barrel towards the end of a plot and a point, and to more sort of like wander the world and move circularly. And that's why he put these footnotes in. So my thesis is that all of these features are meant to make you stop paying attention to plot and start paying attention to the major themes of the story. And I've got 3 of those. 2 of them are backed up by quotes that David Foster Wallace made around the time that he wrote the book. 1, addiction and consumption. This was an interview with Terry Gross on Fresh Air in 1997. You can hear the whole interview yourself. They still have it in their archives, and she replays it whenever something David Foster Wallace related happens in the world. Look, a lot of the impetus to writing Infinite Jest was just the fact that I was about 30, and I had a lot of friends who were about 30, and we'd all been grotesquely overeducated and privileged our whole lives, and had better health care and more money than our parents did. And we were all extraordinarily sad. I think it has something to do with being raised in an era when really the ultimate value seems to be, let's see, you make a lot of money, you have a really attractive spouse, or you get infamous or famous in some way. So that it's a life where you basically experience as much pleasure as you possibly can, which all ends up being sort of empty and low calorie. You can see that it's hard to quote him in slides. You can see that he talks the way that he writes, in terms of grammatically correct sentences that hang for an entire page. We all pick different forms of substance, but the condition of modern life is one in which consuming, in one way or another, keeps us feeling fulfilled until it doesn't. And that's his point about drug addiction. He talks about this over and over, and he would do this in the book, and he does it outside of the book, about how the condition of addiction is to love a substance that seems fun, but it becomes less and less fun as you continue to need it more and more, until you get to the point that you hate it, that you can't live without it. And he's suggesting that this is not just substances, though there are this, but Wallace thinks that sort of consumption and addiction are things that sort of like enslave people in the modern world in all sorts of different ways. So we see dozens of different characters whose addictions run the gamut from drugs and alcohol, to fame, to professional success, to media fandom, to political ideology. And the book wants to give us all of the myriad ways that people become dependent on their consumption, until their consumption consumes them. And if there is a central, moral, principled point of this book, I think that's it. And he basically said that in the quote before, right? He wants to dramatize how he thinks that is what life is like in America in the late 20th century. Theme 2, empathy and tolerance. And this is a quote that's in Burns' edited book, Conversations with Author David Foster Wallace. I don't remember which specific interview this is. If you operate, which most of us do, from the premise that there are things about the contemporary US that make it distinctively hard to be a real human being, then maybe half of fiction's job is to dramatize what it is that makes it tough. The other half is to dramatize the fact that we still are human beings now, or at least we can be. The book focuses on all of these minor characters because it wants to restore them to humanity. These are people, as he will also mention many times in the book, they're in many ways the lost, the abandoned, and the overlooked of society. The folks that he talks several times about, urban dwellers who just give a wide berth to the people that they see in the street. The people that many aspects of society would prefer to not pay attention to or believe in. Much as Onan has decided to tell itself it's the cleanest nation in the world by throwing all of its waste into another country, he would suggest that respectable American society perhaps just chooses not to see the sort of like human cost of the society that we've structured. And again, that I feel like is a point that has particular political meaning. Sort of right now, just within the past like week or two, you can draw your own conclusions there. So what this book wants to do is represent real people with dire struggles that usually wouldn't be represented in any media, and represent them in their own authentic voices. It spends so much time on them, to the point that it drowns out the nominal plot of the book, because it doesn't want you to make other people instruments in your own story. It wants you to consider everyone as a unique and flawed human being who's making their own way in the world. And in terms of like the forms and the procedures of this book, like this is what it's trying to do with these long digressions and sort of like character sketches. It's why he wrote all these sketches of people that he knew on the drug scene before he'd even written the book and sort of worked them in. He just wants you to see the type of people that he met. And whatever else you might say about the man, he was a good listener, and he was a keen observer of human psychology. These are both skills that AA demands of a person and that you develop in AA, and you can see it throughout the book. Finally, time and memory. Remember that Wallace wrote his undergraduate thesis on time and free will. Remember that addiction, or whatever, not remember, but consider, I hope, that addiction is the greatest challenge that there is to the idea of free will. You have to do this thing that you don't want to do. And the ability to overcome it is maybe the greatest evidence for free will. Continuity of time manifests through the footnotes and the jumping chronological order of the story. What do I mean by the continuity of time? There's a key part of the book where one of the characters at the halfway house carries around their stash, their reserve stash of crack, in a copy of a book by William James, which winds up getting cited several times. William James is the brother of Henry James, the novelist, and was at the time maybe actually the more famous brother. The less people know about him now. He was the founder, basically, of American empirical psychology. And one of the things that he was interested in is the human perception of time. And he actually, while he was at Harvard, wound up teaching an inordinate number of the authors who would become famous American modernists. So he was, among other things, Gertrude Stein's and T.S. Eliot's teacher. And Gertrude Stein actually worked in his research lab, and much has been made of that. And other authors were reading either him or his French counterpart, Henri Bergson. Joyce was. And a lot of people have oftentimes said that modernist literature was obsessed with the idea of representing the psychological experience of time. So we can think about the French novelist Marcel Proust, In Search of Lost Time. The idea that all of these books that William James was trying to capture, that modernism is trying to capture, is that you never exist just in the moment. What you do at any given point, this is where free will comes into time, is determined by your entire past life. Everything that you believe and every belief you act on is grounded on your assumptions about how the world works based on your past experiences. And whether or not you're even conscious of it, all of that is hanging in the background of your mind at any time. Nice. Sorry. So all of that's hanging in the background of your mind, informing everything that you do at any given moment. The idea is that the past is always bearing down on the present. You're always existing as your past self and your present self all at once. So what the digressions are doing, and what the footnotes are doing, is helping you see that in these people. Because this is especially the case when we talk about, for instance, dysfunctional families. When we have relationships with each other where a person does something, and to an outside observer, it seems like the smallest thing. Why does that matter? But one person sees it and says, you always do this, and all of a sudden there's this huge fight. And there's this huge fight because both of those people are carrying the entire past of their relationships between them in what they're doing now in the present. It comes to bear in their psychology. And what the footnotes and the sort of jumps through time are doing is helping you see all of this through the Incandenza family and a number of the addicts. A person will say something to another person and there's a footnote, and you're like, why is there a footnote there? And then you go to read the footnote and you get a 3-page story that's about this thing that happened between these people that you now understand as structuring the entire moment that's occurring between them. That's what he's trying to do. Those are the 3 themes that I think can probably try and help you get through this book. It's about addiction and how addiction relates to consumption in American society. It's about trying to use literature to represent the dignity of people that would oftentimes be forgotten or not represented. And it's about how the past haunts all of us. What you can keep in mind as you try and read this. This is like me trying to part with some advice. I've got some do's and some don'ts for reading Infinite Jest. Do. Get lost in the moment. Don't worry about whether or not you're doing a good job of reading Infinite Jest. Worry about whether or not what's on the page in front of you is something that seems to have any kind of entertaining or intellectual merit. Do. Try to learn about any new subjects that the book brings up. Like the Wikipedia vortex. If you start to see something that's an interesting concept that's being raised, and you have to sort of like read up a little bit on that concept, even if you have to set the book down, these books want you to think that that's actually a productive educational impulse of reading them. Take it as an opportunity to learn more about this world that you will never understand in its entirety. Do try to find empathy for realistic characters that are usually overlooked by fiction. And keep in mind that some of these portraits are going to be absolutely harrowing. And that's a part of why he thinks it's important to present them. And do try to have an engaged intellectual interest in the philosophical conversations. When people decide that all of a sudden they're going to stop and talk about how game theory informs international relations in the Cold War. This happens when they're playing, the kids have developed this tennis game, right, that's meant to like kind of like Risk, but it like several orders of magnitude more complex, where they use a supercomputer to sort of like simulate nuclear war. I heard, right, that the website has the music video that simulates that game. Am I right?
I know Kara's got it on, maybe on our blog,
okay.
I think. Yeah, but
yeah.
Yeah.
So if you have a hard time with that scene, some people do. The music video actually dramatizes it very well and shows you how it all works. But like when people are having these conversations, you know, try not to get bogged down in asking yourself why we're having this conversation, right? If the conversation is one that seems like it might be interesting, just have the conversation and see where it goes. Do not worry if you can't see an overall point. I promise it's not because you're not smart enough, it's not because you don't have good taste, it's not because you lack enough knowledge. This book is trying to confuse you because they think there's a philosophical point in being confused. So don't worry about that. Don't get down on yourself, okay? You can do this. Don't assume that the confusion means you're missing anything. You're not. Don't expect that every question you have is going to have an answer. A lot of the questions actually do have answers if you search, but not all of them do. And don't assume that they will. And don't look for the book to ever tell you what the point is. If you keep reading through this, one of the most frustrating experiences you're going to have is that people will always be asking you, oh yeah, I've always meant to read that book, what's it about? And you will not be able to answer that question. And if you try, you'll sound like a jerk. Like pretentious. And I've had this experience many times, and you know, that's just part of the territory. And remember, persevere. That's how I got through Gravity's Rainbow. My best, least intellectual, most AA advice, one day at a time, is to just grind it out. That's how I got through the book. To just be, if I'm really going to do this, if you're as stubborn as I was and just weren't going to let yourself not finish, is to just sit down and be like, I'm going to read my, whatever it is, 10 pages a day, 20 pages a day, 30 pages a day. I would not recommend ingesting more than 30 or 40 unless you're, I do sometimes, but I'm more used to it. But whatever your limit is. Do your little bit every day and just do it and just move your eyes over the page and don't worry about how much you understand it, and you will get to the end. It's right if you do that. And you will get to the end having learned a lot and having come up with a lot of opinions, whether or not you think that you understand what the entirety of the book is. There's actually a strategy. I never taught this book in a class, but I've taken some classes on Ulysses, and I've thought about teaching a class on Gravity's Rainbow. I don't know if people would take it. One of the strategies for reading these books is actually to have people spend the first 3 weeks reading the whole book. And what they do is they actually just say, okay, I'm going to give you 60 or 80 pages, and if you do that 60 or 80 pages like every day, you'll actually get through this 900-page monster in like 2 or 3 weeks. And what I'm telling you to do is to just read through it and just keep moving. Don't stop, don't reread anything, don't ask any questions, don't even worry if you understand it or not. Just get your eyes over all the words. And you'll come in 2 times a week with me and we'll talk about basic themes. And then once we've done that, we have some sense of what the book's structure is, and we remember every part, kinda. And then you spend the next 12 weeks going through the book 100 pages at a time and really digging into what it's doing. I'm not suggesting that anybody do that now because it's hard enough to get through it once, but it is just something to say that in your first pass on one of these books, if you need to find a way to just enjoy the process of getting through it, because you're not going to finish it, and just get it, even to the extent that it can be got. All right, and then the resources. Most of my outside information came from these sources, and you can use them as much or as little as you want, but all of these big books oftentimes have some compendiums and some resources that you can use to help you through them. So I just thought I'd tell people about them. One is Robert Bell and William Dowling's A Reader's Companion to Infinite Jest. This is a fantastic technical breakdown of the plot and structure of the book. So it's got a glossary that tells you what all of the made-up terms and all of the slang, the accurate slang, mean. So that, it'll explain to you that eliminating your map means killing someone, and whatnot, that Bing is cocaine, that Bob Hope is what they call marijuana, all those kinds of things. And it also has a fascinating chapter where it gives you a summary of the arc of every character's plot. It has a section where it actually goes through chapter by chapter and summarizes the plot of every chapter, so if you were confused what was happening, you can find it and read the plot summary. And it also discusses the key themes. If you want to get a little bit more advanced, but still quite accessible, Stephen J. Byrne, he was out at WashU giving a talk once. He's a nice guy. He's one of the main Wallace scholars. He has this book called David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest, A Reader's Guide. This is the 2nd edition, and it's better, and you want to make sure you get the 2nd edition.
Okay.
But it's just basically got a sequence of 4 or 5 essays that are about 15 pages long each of which tackles one is what's he doing with the plot structure, one is what are his aesthetics, one is where does he sit in literary history. And it's a little more English professory, but it's still written to be about as accessible as it can be. So it's not that difficult. Something that you might want to keep open on your computer, if you have one next to you while you read, is Infinite Jest Wiki. I gave the URL here, which I guess people can, if they can see that on the screen, they can write it down. But you can also just Google Infinite Jest Wiki, and probably actually the first thing that will come up is the Wikipedia entry on the novel. But the second one will be the wiki, which is a user-generated sort of annotation, page-by-page annotation of the book. It is not useful in the way that these are, but this is kind of its strength and its weakness, because all it does is just define every single word that might be confusing. And it doesn't do anything else. So normally when you see these things, they might explain pop culture references, or they might tell you this comes up again on such and such a page, or they might give you historical background. It doesn't do any of that. So if you want that, you got to look elsewhere. But if you just want to know what every mathematical or chemical term means, right, or what the translations of all the different languages that are getting used are and stuff like that, that will tell you. And it goes page by page by page. So you can just keep it open on your computer, and every time you hit a page, you're like, what does that mean? And you flick over and look, and it'll tell you. And then if you're interested in doing some outside research, D.T. Max wrote a book called Every Love Story is a Ghost Story. That's basically the biography of Wallace. And it's actually what began the sort of biographical turn when people started talking about how much of the man himself is just present in the book. Before it had long been speculated that he had been in a halfway house somewhere in Boston because of the way the book was written that nobody knew. And, you know, like the specifics of his drug use were not clear because he had never spoken much about it, but that's all more known now. So, yeah, that's what I have.